What I want us to do is look at the whole subject of Bible translation, and the basic orientation is this, that the Bible is the most translated book. There are 23 centuries of translation that we could look at, because parts of the Old Testament begin to be translated in the 3rd century BC, and that most people encounter the Bible through translation. My outline is I'm going to look at contemporary debates, ancient translations, early modern ones. I'm going to look at some tests for literalness, and then I'm going to look at the questions of power and translation. So let's look at contemporary debates. This is what I got sent as an email. Someone was inviting me to take part in a book, and this is what they said on behalf of anonymous publishers. I'd like to invite you to join several other scholars in contributing to a new 3 Views book. You know, there's the 3 Views on 3 Views book as well, which has come out lately. This one on Bible translation. We're proposing to address 3 types of translations: formal equivalents, that's more literal, e.g. NASB, New American Standard Bible, and ESV, English Standard Version; functional equivalents, that's the NLT, New Living Translation, and the Contemporary English Bible; and mediating approaches, that's the Holman version and the NIV. And they were inviting me to go for the formal equivalents. Well, I did decline this, and the reason why is I thought, I'm blown if I am going to accept a position on an extreme and allow someone else the middle ground. Why should I allow someone else the middle ground? I don't think that is the middle ground, but we have to look at what is the question of the centre of the road, and that is clearly how some people see the centre of the road. There are literal translations, there are paraphrases like the New Living Translation, and there are sort of middle of the road translations. Well, I want us to look at the whole question of how we would gauge where a middle actually was. Let's look at ancient translations. Can we work out a biblical way of translating? That would be nice if we could. I would like to argue that we can't, because the New Testament quotations of the Old could be used to support more than one view. You get sometimes quite literal renderings where in Galatians 3, Paul will home in on the fact that it says seed in the Greek, and therefore that corresponds to a singular in the Hebrew. On the other hand, you could have a case of Hebrews where the book of Hebrews quotes the psalm which says, "My ears you have pierced, as a body you have prepared for me." Let's look at early Greek translations. The first translation I call the 70. Other people like to call it the Septuagint, and I don't like the term Septuagint because it's only quite a recent term. The 70 are people, and they are said to have just done the first 5 books, whereas nowadays when people buy a Septuagint, it has a whole load more books that only later got attributed to the Septuagint or the 70. Then there are these unnamed translations of other parts of the Old Testament. But what happens over a while, over the first few centuries after that, is that there are various Jewish translations which either we have given modern names to, or there are ancient names for, which express dissatisfaction with the first form of Greek translation. And almost all of them are seeking to get greater conformity to the Hebrew by being more literal. This is how one scholar says it can't be... one cannot deny the fact that a literal but not a slavish rendering was the characteristic trait of the Septuagint. Look at Syriac translations. That's a form of Aramaic, which I did my PhD on. The first translation is fairly literal, but that doesn't say much because Aramaic and Hebrew are quite similar. So if you're going to line up their words, the words are just going to line up in a similar order anyway. But then the first rendering of the Gospels is a little bit more idiomatic. There are times when 2 verbs might become 1 because they're meant to have the same sense. But as the translations go on through time, the culture gets more and more literal, which of course is interesting because the tendency nowadays may be the reverse. Some people say, but what about the Aramaic Targum, plural Targumim? Aren't those translations quite paraphrastic? You might have heard a Targumic paraphrase or something like that. And I would want to say no. Here's the Hebrew of Genesis 4 verse 1, which says, Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and she said, I have caned or possessed or acquired a man with the help of the Lord. This is how the Aramaic translation renders it, the Aramaic Targum. Now you don't need to know Hebrew to know that you're looking at something really rather similar. The W at the beginning is the word and, this is the word no, this is the object marker, this is the word Eve, this is the word wife. They line up basically with each other. And so you can say in this case, although these Targumim, these are Aramaic translations which are used in the synagogue, sometimes will expand something, as at the end where it says from before the Lord, which is a little bit of a paraphrase of with the Lord. Although they will do those sorts of expansions and sometimes expand many, many words, they are characterized by being pretty literal and then having an expansion where they might go off for several verses where they just add a whole load extra. But that's not quite the same as a modern paraphrase. There's another example of something similar. What did Jerome say when he was talking about his own translation of the Latin Vulgate? For I myself not only admit but freely proclaim that in translating from Greek, except in the case of the Holy Scriptures, where even the order of the words is a mystery, I render sense for sense, not word for word. So normally he translates one way, but when it comes to the Bible, he translates another way in a more literal way. So I would generalize about early translations that the Bible gets towards the center of the culture, they tend to be literal, and the missional movement is that they want to increase literalism through time. Of course, literalism doesn't mean archaic. For us, literal translations tend to be old translations, but for them they're actually quite new. It means inventing new terms, like the word angel in your language, in the receptor language may not exist, so you invent it in order to translate. Of course, there's more variety than I'm allowing for. Let's go to early modern translations. Here's the title page of the King James Version, which says, the Holy Bible, containing the Old Testament and the New, newly translated out of the original tongues, I think, and with the former translations diligently compared. So it says it's from the original, but also compared with earlier translations. The thing about the King James Version, about 400 years old, is it's really pretty literal. The English serves the Greek or the Hebrew. It sometimes uses small print, or in later versions italics, to show words not in the original, and the notes are there to give you closer access to the original, not trying to make it easier for the reader. So here's the opening page of the King James Version. I don't know how much you can see, but what I'll do is I'll show you that there are these points where you get small print. This is what the word was, this is the word was, this is the word were. That's because in Hebrew, the way they speak is like to say me Tarzan. I mean, they don't use a verb, or I Tarzan if you prefer. The point is, they don't say I am Tarzan, just I Tarzan is the way they do it. And so the translators feel so conscientious, they don't want to add the verb to be without letting the readers know that they do this. Then in the margin, we have these notes. Now, they're hard to read, but the very first note says, Hebrew, between the light and between the darkness. Now this is because it says God divided the light from the darkness, and the translators feel so guilty of having rendered it that way that they want to tell you that actually the Hebrew more literally says between the light and between the darkness. Now no modern translator would bother telling you that. And all of the other marginal notes begin HEB or HEBR for the Hebrew and give you a more literal rendering of the Hebrew. So I got a research assistant to have a look at this and said, what are the notes in the margins or the footnotes of Bibles doing? And she looked at the Pentateuch and Isaiah and said, if we go to the King James Version, the majority of notes are giving you more literal renderings. 2/3, about 1/3 are giving you alternatives, and a very few are making it easier. So, you know, the sort of notes that are there to tell you what an ephah is or a shekel or something, they don't even bother with those sorts of things. You're supposed to know that sort of stuff. When we look at the English Standard Version, fewer are giving you more literal renderings, more are giving you alternatives. When we look at something like the NIV, the majority seem to be alternatives or making easier. So it sort of tells you something that's going on. Let's try and test for literalness. I want to lay out a few translations. Now, I don't know whether you read Hebrew, Greek or Latin. It doesn't really matter if you do or don't for our purposes. Here's the Hebrew across the top, but I've given you a pretty literal rendering of the Hebrew. This is when God sends Samuel to anoint one of Jesse's sons, and said, God, the Lord, a heifer of cattle you will take in hand of you, that means in your hand, and you will say, to sacrifice to the Lord I have come. Now the Greek has and, there's and, said, Lord, right? Heifer of cattle, that's there, take. That's an imperative, not you will take. So it doesn't use a future, you will take, it gives the imperative, take. In hand of you, and you will say, to sacrifice to the Lord I have come. Okay, the Vulgate, the Latin, and said the Lord. Okay, a heifer from the flock, from the herd. So that from is a bit of a paraphrase. You will take. So that doesn't say take, which would be tolle. It says you will take, tolles, in your hand, and you will say, for sacrificing to the Lord I have come. Now let's go to the King James Version. Now the King James Version people think of as a literal translation. Let's look at this. It doesn't say, and said the Lord, it says, and the Lord said. Then it says, instead of a heifer from the flock, it says, an heifer, you see? So it's forgetting that you've got a twofold phrase here in Hebrew, a twofold phrase in Greek, a twofold in Greek and in Latin. It's just got one word. Then it says take instead of you will take, and the take doesn't come after the heifer. You see, a heifer you will take. Then instead of in your hand, it says with thee. Because obviously the idea of having a heifer in your hand, it would have to be quite a small heifer. And so that doesn't really work. And then and say, and instead of to sacrifice to the Lord I have come, it says I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. Now that's because in Oldie English they used to say I am come rather than I have come. And basically the ESV is exactly the same as that, but with slightly modernised English. Now, the point there is we think of the King James as really pretty literal. We think of the ESV as really pretty literal, but comparatively for that verse, you can see on several accounts it really is less literal. Now, one of the reasons, of course, is the constraints of English, because we have constraints about word order. I mean, we're allowed to say, said simple Simon to the pieman. Occasionally, you're allowed to get the word order that way round, but on the whole, we can't. And that means in order to render it into English, the decision is not that we're going to say, and said the Lord. You're going to say, and the Lord said. This one, a heifer with you take, again, it wants to have the verb up front. But arguably, you could do it the other way. But the interesting thing is, Latin and Greek have far more flexibility in word order. As you saw Jerome saying, even the word order really matters, and they have rendered that. So that's interesting. Let's go to John 1:1. Famous verse. In this, I'm giving you a literal rendering. In beginning was the word. No capitals, by the way. Either no capitals or all capitals. I don't mind which way you go, but in the original Greek, there's no distinction. In beginning was the word, and the word was towards the God. There we got a word towards, and there's a word the God, and God was the word. God well, we'll come on to the capitalization of God shortly. I'm just trying to give you a sense of that word, that verse. Now notice, we tend to say the word was God now, and I think that's very legitimate, but we need to think about it. Now I'm giving you some of the early versions. This is Syriac, Sahidic, which is Coptic, 4th century translation, and the Vulgate. So they're all about the 4th century in Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. So these are early translations, very important early translations. What do they do? Well, in the beginning was word. There's the word word, melathar. And the word was with, there's a word like a bit like Allah, God, and God was the word. Notice God comes before the word. Now let's go for the Sahidic. In the beginning was Peshatya. Peshatya is the word. Per is the Shatya word. And, that's awo. Peshatya, the word was with God. Penute, per is the, Nuta is God. And awo, right? A God was the word. Notice God comes first. Latin, in the beginning was verbum, and the verbum was with God, and God was the word. So they're all got God before the word. Let's go to the Anglo-Saxon. Some of you might have done this. I don't know how to pronounce this, but on fruman was Wort, okay, and dat Wort was mit Gode, and God was dat Wort. So that's a the. You know that anyway. The point is, God comes first. Wycliffe's translation, in the beginning was the word. And the word was at God, and God was the word. Okay, notice small g. The capital G for God comes quite a bit later. Earliest Luther translation, in the beginning was the word, and the word was by God, and God was the word. Notice they all have that order. Let's go to the earliest Tyndale translation. In the beginning was that word, and that word was with God, and God was that word. But between 1526 and 1537, this is what happens by the time you come to the Matthew's Bible. In the beginning was the word, so there's not that anymore, and the word was with God, and the word was God. And that, of course, has then influenced where you have a lot of German translations, original ones, saying, and God was the Word. Now they all say, and the Word was God. Now, there is a real legitimacy to that. And the reason why is there's a the on the word God. And so, even though it's second, it makes sense grammatically to say the whole thing is about God. The third phrase is a sentence about God, not a sentence about the Word. But we notice this tendency in word order, and the word order we now have was not in any of the really early translations. Let's go to a famous passage like the passage about love. You know, love bears all things, okay? And all that sort of stuff. This is the way the Greek puts it. Panta is the word for all. All things it bears, all things it believes, all things it hopes, all things it endures. Notice all things comes first. The Latin, all things it suffers, all things it believes, all things it hopes, all things it sustains. So the all things comes first. We come to the King James and the order is reversed. Verb first, then the all things. Believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Now, we come to the Revised Standard Version and the English Standard Version, and they've added a noun to help the poor reader understand that we're actually talking about love or for the rhythm or something like that. And so here we have love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. The NIV doesn't add that noun, but instead of having all things, it now gives us always. Always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. The New Living Translation has gone one step further and has decided to go for the negative for the first two clauses. Love never gives up, never loses faith, and so on, is always hopeful and endures through every circumstance. So you can see, if you like, if you sort of plot them through time, what exactly is happening. Let's look at some other tests of literalness. Look at the word behold, or the meaning of know, in the sense of having intercourse with someone, to beget. By the way, begetting doesn't exist anymore. Men can father, but they can't actually beget. What I mean by that is begetting is not the same as fathering, and it's not the same as inseminating. Because begetting is actually a social function which no longer exists. Does that make sense? So you could actually look at, that's why one of the reasons that actually it's quite difficult for people to render beget, because fathers don't do anything nowadays, if you see what I mean. That statement needs some qualification. Okay, you can think about it. So other ones are these God of gods, Lord of lords, heaven of heavens, and so on. And the use of italics to distinguish words not in the original. Now I got a very capable undergraduate research assistant to look at these, how many languages there were, 10 or so, 11, and say what's going on in translations in those languages. And so she was able to do that. And we look at pre-1800 Protestant translations, Catholic ones and post-1950 ones, and we find basically the old Protestant ones do basically render this word behold. Catholic ones a little bit less. The word to know, in the sense of have intercourse with, again, the older translations tend to have. The word to beget, the Catholic translations are very strong on. Now that's a big thing there. But the modern ones don't have that so much. God of gods, so on, is a little bit less keen. And it's the Protestant translations that tended to use italics. Modern translations, even literal ones, don't. Or look at it another way. Got a few tests. Here are our pre-1800 Protestant translations, all clustering basically towards the literal end of a spectrum. The Catholic translations not going right to this far end of the non-literal rendering, and they can be in different places. The modern ones more spread. Of course, there are modern literal translations, and that's why we'd expect more of a spread. So you can have a look at this on specifically the subject of knowing someone in the sense of having intercourse with them, where it's the NIV that gives you quite a few varied phrases. So what's going on in these translations? Well, I think there are various factors that could be influencing this. One is the topic of, or the discipline, academic discipline of linguistics, which means that you're able to take a sentence and almost map it mathematically, analyze it, and therefore recast it. That can give you a confidence of recasting a sentence and saying, we have lost nothing semantically, nothing of the meaning. And that's one of those things that, for those who think that language is all about meaning, that will be a very important thing for them. Computers, of course, enable you to be consistent in a translation in a way that people didn't have to in the past. You could say there are certain social changes of industrialization, hierarchy, less hierarchy, feminism, which may influence translation, the visual culture and so on. But I think more significant could be, of course, that the Bible is more peripheral to the culture. One of the things that's also happened is there's been a lot of missionary experience going out and translating the Bible in places which have no written language at all, and people have developed theory in order to do that, and sometimes have brought that theory back to the West and said we need to take that into account as we translate. The general outcome is that I think basically after about 1950, Bible translations are less literal. So this is how one person puts it. The Bible translation in the early centuries began as literal translation, though not slavishly literal, and today we find that it has often changed to become a sensus de sensu, sense from sense or meaning from meaning, translation. And you could say the pendulum swung even further, because it's this month that there's a big report on Wycliffe Bible translators where there's been a discussion about whether we should even render phrases like Son of God literally, because the danger is if you render Son of God literally, you will then think that God has physically begotten. And in order to avoid that, people say maybe you should avoid that term, and the report will come out later this month. So that's the talk about God the Father. So if I can schematize, I would say up until perhaps the 20th century, there's a mission-driven move towards literalism. That is, as the gospel gets more and more in a culture, or Christianity takes over a culture more and more, they demand a more and more literal translation. So I don't think there's ever been a culture where the Bible was at the center and they didn't want a literal translation. On the other hand, what we seem to have in the late 20th century and beyond is a mission-driven move away from literalism. I mean, if we have a literal translation, how can we ever reach people? How will they ever understand? How will they know what I'm going to say? Won't they be put off because the words are so difficult to understand, and so on? And, we can't have Zion speak and, Christian speak, because that just doesn't communicate with people. That's not the language going on out there, and isn't axiomatically, some people would say, axiomatically, translation is translating into the language that people use. Now, I would challenge that as an axiom of what translation is, but for some people that is an axiom. I mean, some people would say, one of these literal translations in archaic English, some people would say, that's not English, or that's not translation, because for them that really is axiomatic, that that's the way things work. And we could say there's a third phase, possibly mission-driven theological adaptation. Now I want to come on to the exciting bit for me, which is the whole question of why and the whole question of power. Because a lot of power exercise is going on. We notice how there are many modern groups who are happy to change language. Take terms like gay or Kindle, mouse, text window, which have been given their older terms, which have been given new meanings, because groups have felt that they are able to introduce that new meaning. You can introduce not only that, but brand new words. No one is put off from going into certain places to drink just because they call something a venti and you don't know what a venti is. If you don't know what a venti is, then you will learn very soon what a venti is. And that actually can be a form of marketing. So many restaurants, instead of calling their food standard food like potatoes, they will call them pommes de terre or whatever it is. They will use some exotic foreign phrase to describe something perfectly normal. And so what we find is a whole load of new words are being created in marketing and in certain groups. Some of them can be very foreign words. Interesting how the word Quran has changed from K-O-R-A-N, perfectly good English word, to a Q-U, in which the U is a vowel, not a sort of just joining onto the consonant there. are apostrophe an to such an extent that a president would even pause halfway through this word to pronounce that. And it's very interesting how that apostrophe has sort of forced its way into life. I mean, if I got really upset every time someone didn't say a particular word one particular way, how many people would I be able to get to pronounce it my way? And, you know, if I really did get very upset, and there were a number of us who maybe got upset, what would we be able to do? It's often a question of power. So having foreign words doesn't necessarily mean you can't make an impact on a culture. In fact, I'd say all groups with cultural power change language. And in fact, changing language is not just a way of exercising power, it's a way of acquiring power. Now, you can't just go off into your own language on your own and expect anyone to follow. Although they do say that, you know, the difference between a leader and an idiot is whether someone else actually goes after them. But I guess it's possible to be an idiotic leader as well. But the point is this, that changing language, there is a whole question of power here. So we asked the challenging question, what new terms have Christians come up with, invented in the last 50 years? Have we invented any terms? And I haven't yet been suggested to me a major term that's actually made an impact in the language. There are words like atonement, but these are very old words for us, which are now used in the language. If we look at film industry, we can find remnants of Christian language all over the place. But in terms of new language to express the newness of the Christian message, do we have any that have actually made it out there, or even that we've tried to get out there? I'm not sure we do. That's rather strange, because if we do want cultural power, shouldn't we be thinking of new terms that would actually have some influence out there? And the fact that we don't have new words, or are not trying to suggest them, might be an admission that we don't think we do have much cultural power. Take William Tyndale. He did invent some new words. He also popularized some words that were really pretty obscure at the time. So he felt he had a certain cultural power. We could say that the Apostle Paul did the same when he used the word brothers or siblings, or when he started calling people saints or holies. Very unusual to start calling ordinary Joe Blow a holy person when, you know, everyone knows that sacred language might be used for a temple, but why are you using it for a priest? But why are you using it for just an ordinary person who happens to be a slave? It doesn't really make much sense. We can look at a term like sex. Now, I like to think that sex has only been invented in the last 200 years. It's a social construct. There is no such thing as sex, and Christians should be against it. That is, sex is a medical term, I suppose you could say. It's a mechanical term. It basically tries to group together a number of experiences that people have on their own or in groups of two or upwards, and say it's all sex, if you see what I mean. Right? Does that make sense? But it basically views everything mechanically. There's no social context for that. It doesn't or moral context for that. So whereas the Bible might say that Amnon humbled Tamar, or it might say that Adam knew his wife, and of course that may entail what is referred to by this word, but it is not exhausted by this word, because this word is just thinking entirely mechanically. And so that mechanical thing has only, I would say, been relatively recently invented. Once you have the word of sex, of course, and you give it a name, and remember, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin have no word for sex. So it doesn't mean, of course, that people didn't know how to make children. It just means that they haven't identified and isolated from everything else that goes on something called sex. Does that make sense? And so once you've got that, you can then have a word like sex, and I can then invent something called sexuality from that, and I can invent a word like homosexual and homophobic. But you see, by the time I've got to this word, it's actually a fourth level abstraction from this word, and I don't need to believe any of those words at all. I don't need to use that conceptuality at all, because I'm free to use my own concept. So if someone wants to use any of those words, they're perfectly free, and I can use those words in order to speak their language, but I can also insist that I will speak my own language. And so I'm very very happy to talk about things, but what we've got to realise is there's no ethical Esperanto, that language that everyone can use together that's neutral territory. There isn't. So I can use their language, I can use my language. So I'm not a heterosexual, I'm married, I'm a man, but I don't need to use terms that have come from elsewhere, and I can choose, in fact, to reject them, and that's perfectly fine. You may want to ask me about that. So I think it's very interesting because, of course, you get a word like this will turn up in a Bible translation. So I'd say one of the things that's interesting is that Christians are very unwilling to change language. One of the reasons, of course, could be that we're concerned about sensitivity to the target culture. But there, we can be wrongly viewing the target culture as like an antique, which can't possibly be changed. Now, when all the mobile phone companies go to Africa, they don't think, oh dear, this is a culture we mustn't possibly disturb. So people are disturbing culture all of the time. The danger is that we can have an idea of culture able to be frozen in time when that isn't possible. What I think actually is going on is that we think we haven't got much cultural power and we're not very confident in our product. Starbucks is confident in its product, therefore it can give it a strange name. Could it be, therefore, that relevant translations actually result in less cultural power and therefore more irrelevance? Could that be what is going on? Is there any empirical evidence that our striving to be more relevant actually makes people take more notice of us? And that would be something we could talk about. Early churches did change language. So the challenge and the question I'd like to leave us with is, what do you do when the Bible's not at the centre of a culture? It has been at the centre and it's now gone to the edge. That's a different thing from what happened in the early church, where you could say it was at the edge of a culture and it made its way to the centre. For us, we could say the Bible has been at the centre and it's now made its way to the edge, which means, of course, we have all of the terms that we need, but they all sound rather old. Steve Jobs says a lot of the times people don't know what they want until you show it to them. So that might be what we need to do in translation. Of course, literal translation we associate now with being old. Sometimes it is that literal translations are old, but you could have and then people say the more paraphrastic thing tends to be more modern. But it could be a neologism, and making up a new word would be a form of literalism. And you could say that old isn't necessarily bad. Some cultures, old is good. So a lot depends on what old and new mean. Negatively, an old translation could be old and irrelevant. Positively, it could be old and venerable, and therefore it stood the test of time. Negatively, new could be it's novel and therefore has no pedigree. Positively, it could be right up to date. It all depends on what the big meta-narrative of your culture is. And if the meta-narrative is new is better, then that is something which either a translation might adapt to or it might challenge. It could do either. So we want actually to send messages both about the venerable age of the message about Christianity and of its modern relevance. And I'd want to say that perhaps literalism would be the best way forward to do that, because it stakes a huge claim for the importance of the text. So those are and it also helps you do deep study. What might happen if you've got a more functional equivalent thing? Well, I think is a major break with translation in the past. It also makes it harder for readers to look at the message in great detail, and it means that you're not doing much innovation. So those are my rambling thoughts, bit of a sermon.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.